Our scripture this morning comes from the Gospel of Mark. And it's the final chapter in the last 8 verses in Mark's Gospel. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Salome, brought spices, so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man, dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. So they said nothing to anyone. They were afraid. The Holy Scriptures, may the Spirit add an understanding for us. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. It's not a great ending to the story, but it's the ending we have in the Gospel of Mark. When you get an ending like that, you want to fix it, right? Because we're used to hearing Easter stories. There's stories of Jesus and his resurrection told in the other Gospels, where he appears back to the disciples and he spends days with them, eating with them and stuff, and even the story of walking beside you with disciples on the road. But here in the Gospel of Mark, we get this abrupt ending. Now, Mark starts out in the usual fashion like the other Gospels. It's early Sunday morning, the first day of the week. It's still dark. The sun is just coming up. The women are going to the tomb to prepare Jesus' body, and the stone is rolled away, and they hear the word that Jesus has been raised. He's not there. They don't find him in the tomb. But then, terror and amazement. They were afraid. It says they told no one. It's the only resurrection story in the Bible or in the Gospels where Jesus never actually makes an appearance. And that's a problem. Now, if you're astute readers, and you know your Gospel of Mark, you know probably in your Bibles there is another ending. That there is stories of Jesus and his resurrection, some stories of his appearance to his disciples. But most scholars, the vast majority, believe that Mark actually ended here in verse 8. And that those stories were added later by scribes as they were copying down the Bible for different copies. They didn't have a copy machine back then. They had to literally write word for word. And it's easy to see why some monk who was scribing said, "You know what, this is a horrible ending. I've heard some of these other stories. I'm going to fix the ending of Mark." And they added some of the stories at the end. And scholars don't believe those are the actual ending because the style and the writing has nothing similar to what Mark has written. Nothing in common with the way Mark writes. It's totally different. So why in the world would Mark end his story here with no appearance of Jesus and the women, or those two women disciples, running away in terror and amazement and saying nothing? Well, I think he has a reason. I know he has a reason. But it's strange that the women would run away scared. Because the man sitting there tells them, "Do not be afraid." And anytime else in the Bible, when a story is started with, "Do not be afraid," what immediately follows is good news. From the prophets of old to when Gabriel told Mary that she was going to have a baby, it was started with good news, or it started with "Don't be afraid," and it's always followed with good news. So the man tells him, "Do not be afraid. Jesus, who was crucified, has been raised. He is not here." Then he gives them pretty simple instructions. Go tell the disciples and Peter that he'll meet you in Galilee, just like he's been telling you the 3 years that he's been with you on earth. Yet they run away. It's a resurrection scene and a resurrection story without any appearance of Jesus. Of course, we get that he's not in the tomb, but we don't know anything else. I could have picked a different gospel to read it at the Easter service this morning, but I like Mark's ending. First, there's a couple of just interesting tidbits about the story. Scholars connect the women at the tomb, probably Mary Magdalene, with the woman who anointed Jesus when he was at the beginning of last week's Passion narrative, the woman who anoints him with her hair and the expensive perfume. And they also connect the young man sitting in the tomb with the young man who ran away from the garden when Jesus was arrested. There's a story in Mark where a man runs away, losing his clothes as he runs away from Jesus' arrest in the garden. Actually, the first record ever of a streaker. Ever. It's in the Bible. It's in Mark, I promise. But they connect that with maybe the man sitting in the tomb, who maybe some say is Mark himself, the author of the gospel. I don't know if that's true or not, but Mark makes connections with these people back in his story. So maybe that man was the first one to meet the resurrected Jesus. But here we are, in one of the high points of our Christian year, Easter and Christmas, right? The two big holidays we have for Christians. And sometimes there's an argument over which is better, Christmas or Easter. Easy answer. You give presents at Christmas, you get eggs filled with candy at Easter. Plus, you don't have a death if you don't have a birth, so you got to have Christmas first. So Christmas is better than Easter. But both high holidays for our Christian year and our Christian faith. And then we have this story in Mark, where there are no male gospels even coming to the tomb. Jesus is missing, the tomb is empty, but nobody says anything to anyone. We shouldn't be too hard on these two women, Mary and Mary, who came to this tomb, though, because they followed Jesus. They were coming to do the work of continuing to prepare the body, and they were the first to hear the good news, and they were told to share this good news. They were disciples, thinking of them just along the same lines of the 12 disciples. Plus, they had to be a bit shocked. The stone was rolled away, and Jesus wasn't there. I couldn't imagine things running through their mind. I'm sure as they were walking to the tomb, they were dealing with all kinds of emotions. For they had grown close to Jesus in the years in his ministry. They probably had such high hopes for what he was going to do. They saw him suffering those last few days. I suppose maybe one of even the feelings they may have had could have been relief. Sometimes in the middle of your grief, knowing what the story is at the end, or knowing that the suffering is finally past, you feel a sense of relief. Then they get to the tomb, and the stone is rolled away, and there's a strange man telling them that Jesus isn't here, just like he told you. So it's not hard to imagine terror and amazement and probably wonder and questions. Even maybe part of them thinking, he maybe did tell us he wasn't going to be here. And then all of a sudden thinking, uh-oh, that maybe means that my story isn't over. That if Jesus truly is alive, that our work as disciples has just begun. There's going to be a lot more to do and a lot more danger to face. And so they were scared. Scared because they didn't understand. Scared because maybe they did understand and thought, uh-oh, this means there's more to do. And maybe simply just too filled with God's awe and amazement to know what to do. That empty tomb was a challenge. That empty tomb is a challenge to us too. If you want to recruit new volunteers to your way, ending Mark's gospel this way is not a way to do it. Right? It's like the ending of the television show Sopranos. Did you ever watch that show on television? Would you ever watch a movie where the ending is just kind of left there for you to decide what happened? I hate that, right? You invest time in watching a television series over and over, and then I get to interpret what the ending is, or you watch a movie for a couple hours and the ending is just kind of open to interpretation. It kind of drives me crazy. I like it where it's nice and wrapped up and neat at the end. All the loose ends are tied up. All my questions are answered. I don't have to interpret anything. That's the way you end a book. Or that's the way you end a show or a movie. That's not the way Mark ended his gospel. And I think, or I know that he did it on purpose. Of course, today we look and we know the whole story. Obviously, even in the Gospel of Mark, somebody told about Jesus' resurrection. Even if Mark says that the women went away scared and told no one, eventually the word got out because we have the church. We're sitting here on Sunday morning. Christ's message of resurrection and love and forgiveness and power spread. The church grew. But Mark's story and his ending was a challenge to his readers, and it's also a challenge to us. I saw a quote that someone said, and I really liked it. I can't give proper credit to it because I couldn't remember who did it, but it wasn't me. But this person said, "Today we celebrate God's comment on the death of Jesus. The assurance that God's final word is not death and despair, but resurrection and new life." And that is part of Mark's message. You see, his ending fits his whole gospel. There's kind of a two-part pattern or theme throughout Mark's gospel. The first part is this, that the people who should understand what Jesus is saying, should know what's going on, like the disciples, don't get it. All through Mark, Jesus predicts his passion 3 different times, and yet the disciples are still surprised and don't understand what is going to happen every time he tells them what's going to happen. The disciples don't come off looking very good in Mark's gospel. Again and again, they disappoint Jesus and they don't get the point. They don't get his messages. I have to die and be resurrected. The second theme is those who do understand who Jesus is can't be trusted. There's a demon who possesses a young man, says, "What do you have to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High?" You understand who Jesus is, God's Son. But you're not going to get a good testimony from a demon. Then you have the Roman centurion who immediately after watching Jesus die states, "Truly this man was God's Son." We can't really count on a Roman centurion for a good testimony. So here we are. The people who should know don't. And those who do know who Jesus is can't be counted on to share the story. Except there's one other person who has seen, who has heard everything that Jesus has said and done. One other person who has heard Jesus' predictions, watched as they came through. One other person who has listened to this amazing news of the empty tomb and heard the order to go and tell. Do you know who that person is? It's you. It's me. All the readers of Mark's gospel. Mark writes this open-ended ending that threatens to end in failure. This ending of the book that says Jesus' message is going to end right here. Because he wants us to share that story. We are the ones who have seen the story from beginning to end. The readers of Mark's gospel and the burden of sharing that message of good news, of resurrection, is on us. We are to pick up where the women left off. To tell the story of Jesus of Nazareth that's been crucified and raised, just as he has predicted and promised. It is on us to spread that wonderful news that death and despair is not the end, that Jesus even conquered death. But we don't always feel that sense of awe and wonder and amazement. We hear this story over and over again. It becomes pretty familiar. And sometimes it becomes too familiar because it loses its power for us. We hear it on Easter Sunday morning. We get up early once a year to come celebrate. And then the story's kind of heard over and over again. It loses the power. How many times have we shared our faith with friends or family or neighbors? How many times have we talked about how we have experienced the power of Jesus in our lives? It doesn't come easy for us. Sharing that news sometimes is hard because it seems awkward. But Mark is encouraging us. Mark wants us to be ones to share that story. He doesn't want our tired and old and cynical faith that sometimes is burdened by doubts and questions, to rule our lives. He wants us to believe and then see. That is kind of the whole story of Mark's Gospel. We must finish the story of ourselves. In Mark, we're called to have faith and then trust, to believe and then see. That's kind of the way his ending is. Here it is. Jesus is raised. I offer you no proof except for the empty tomb. Believe and then share my story. Mark calls all of us to be disciples. We are the ones who continue and finish his story. We kind of set out on that path, but we know sometimes the cost can be high. For we know the story of Jesus' disciples. But we can be encouraged because we don't travel that path alone. Jesus has been let loose in the world. He is not in our present as a lifeless corpse or in our past as a distant memory. He goes ahead of us in the future to meet us there and to claim us as his own. So our task this Easter, if you will, is to share the stories of Jesus' resurrection. To know and to share that God will meet us at our points of brokenness. We may not always see God. We may not always understand how God works, but we know because of Easter and that resurrection that God will be there. And we can proclaim that our story, that Jesus' story doesn't end. We know that we are the people of this story. We can tell people that we are still alive, and we love and struggle and die and hope, but not alone. Because we have the church, we have each other, and we have our faith in Jesus. So that sometimes, even though the road may get difficult, challenging, but hope and faith is still there, creating new life. So let us take those promises of Easter, of new life, of power and resurrection over death, and let's share those with our neighbors and our friends, so they too can experience that wonderful love of Christ.